You don't get paid enough to clean up after diplomats, let alone babysit the apex predators of the Orion Spur. Alexander certainly didn't. When the blast doors of the royal suite hissed open, he expected spilled wine or shattered glass. He didn't expect 4 starving, chittering alien infants abandoned in a nest of ripped silk. He definitely didn't expect the terrifying 10-foot-tall matriarch of their species to walk in on him 3 days later, catching him bottle-feeding her babies with a repurposed coolant tube. The right wheel of the janitorial cart had a flat spot. Every third rotation, it emitted a high-pitched, stuttering squeak that drilled directly into the base of Alexander's skull. Squeak thud, squeak thud. He pushed the heavy plastic trolley down the blindingly white corridor of the diplomatic spire's 7th sector, leaning his weight into the handle. His lower back burned. A familiar, dull throbbing centered around his L4 vertebra that always flared up right around hour 10 of his shift. The air in this wing was heavily filtered, thick and sterile, smelling of aggressive synthetic pine and ozone. It was supposed to be comforting. It mostly just gave Alexander a dry cough. He stopped in front of Suite 714. The gold leaf lettering on the heavy plasteel door read, "Reserved for the sovereign envoy of the Kittiness Collectives." Alexander checked his datapad. The screen was cracked, a jagged line bisecting the glowing text. The suite was flagged for a standard deep clean. The envoy, a terrifying 8-foot-tall insectoid diplomat whose translated name was something like High Queen Celine, had supposedly departed for an emergency summit in the core systems. "Left in a hurry," the note said. "Always in a hurry," Alexander muttered, his voice raspy from too much cheap coffee and not enough sleep. He keyed his access card. The heavy door hissed, the pneumatic seals disengaging with a sound like a dying exhale. The smell hit him first. It wasn't the usual mess of spilled alien alcohol or the lingering pheromone stink of diplomatic negotiations. This was raw, biological, and sour. It smelled like crushed beetles, spoiled milk, and burnt copper. Alexander wrinkled his nose, instinctively reaching for the heavy rubber gloves in his back pocket. He pulled them on, the thick latex snapping against his wrists. He stepped inside. The lights were dimmed to a low, bruised purple. The temperature was at least 10 degrees hotter than the hallway, stifling and thick with humidity. Sweat immediately prickled at Alexander's hairline. "Hello?" he called out of habit. Silence, save for the low hum of the climate control systems struggling to maintain the oppressive heat. Alexander grabbed his mop and bucket, wheeling them over the threshold. He rounded the corner into the main living area and stopped dead. The suite was trashed, but not in a party-gone-wrong way. Heavy velvet curtains were shredded, the dark fabric pulled down and piled into a massive, crater-like heap in the center of the sunken living room. The glass coffee table was shattered, pushed to the edges of the room. It looked like an animal had built a nest. Then, the nest moved. Alexander's grip tightened on the mop handle. His knuckles turned white under the yellow rubber of his gloves. He held his breath. A sound drifted up from the center of the velvet pile. It was a weak, wet clicking, followed by a pathetic, high-pitched whine that sounded entirely too much like a human infant with a respiratory infection. Alexander took a slow step forward. His work boots squeaked loudly against the polished floorboards. He froze, but the whining only grew louder, joined by 3 other distinct voices. A chorus of raspy, desperate clicks and cries. He approached the edge of the makeshift nest and peered over the shredded velvet. 4 creatures were huddled together in the center. They were no bigger than house cats, but that was where the earthly comparison ended. They looked like a cross between armored armadillos and oversized praying mantises. Their carapaces were soft, a milky, translucent pale blue, indicating they hadn't hardened yet. They had too many limbs, ending in tiny, sharp-looking hooks, and large, multifaceted black eyes that were currently squeezed shut. They were writhing over one another, clicking frantically, shivering despite the oppressive heat of the room. Alexander let out a slow, ragged breath. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." He looked around the empty suite. The mother was gone. The emergency summit. She had left in a hurry. Had she abandoned them? Forgotten them? Did this species leave their young to fend for themselves? Alexander didn't know anything about alien biology. He knew how to strip floor wax and unclog industrial waste recyclers. The protocol was clear. Any biological anomalies in a diplomatic suite were to be reported immediately to station security. Security would call the xenobiologists. The xenobiologists would quarantine the room, bag the creatures, and probably dissect them, or stuff them in a sterile, cold stasis pod until the red tape cleared. One of the creatures, slightly smaller than the rest, a runt, tumbled down the slope of the velvet nest. It landed on its back near Alexander's boot, its soft, pale underbelly exposed. It flailed its many legs weakly, letting out a sharp, distressed trill. It looked pathetic. It looked terrified. Alexander stared at it. He thought about security. He thought about the cold metal cages in the lower decks. "Not my pay grade," Alexander whispered to himself. He took a step back, reaching for the radio on his belt. The runt suddenly managed to right itself. It dragged its heavy head toward Alexander's boot, pressing its soft, wet snout against the worn leather. It let out a long, vibrating sigh, seemingly comforted by the residual heat radiating from Alexander's foot. Alexander's hand hovered over the radio. He looked down at the tiny, monstrous thing. It was covered in a thin layer of sticky blue amniotic fluid. It was starving. He cursed. He cursed the station. He cursed the alien queen, and he cursed his own stupid soft heart. He dropped his hand from the radio. Instead, he crouched down, his knees popping like firecrackers in the quiet room. He reached out with a thick, yellow-gloved hand and gently nudged the runt back up the slope of the velvet, into the pile with its siblings. "All right," Alexander muttered, rubbing his eyes with the back of his wrist. "All right, let's figure this out." 72 hours. That was how long Alexander had been off the grid. He had locked the heavy blast doors from the inside, overridden the cleaning schedule in the station's mainframe with his janitorial access codes, and turned Suite 714 into a nursery. He smelled terrible. He reeked of stale sweat, dried milk substitute, and the sharp coppery scent of alien vomit. His gray uniform was stained with patches of crusty blue fluid and dark smears of what he desperately hoped was just nutrient paste. Alexander was currently sitting cross-legged on the floor, his back propped against the base of the expensive leather sofa. He was exhausted in a way that felt cellular. His eyelids felt like they were lined with sandpaper. In his left arm, nestled against his chest, was the largest of the quadruplets. Alexander had started calling him Tank. Tank was aggressively suckling from a makeshift bottle Alexander had rigged out of a flexible thermal coolant tube and a discarded medical syringe he'd stolen from the infirmary supply closet. The formula was a desperate guess. equal parts human infant formula, procured from the station's residential commissary, unflavored nutrient paste, and dissolved sugar packets from the guard's break room. To Alexander's immense relief and surprise, it hadn't killed them. In fact, they loved it. Tank's mandibles clicked happily around the rubber tube, his multifaceted eyes half closed in a milky haze of food coma. His pale blue carapace had started to darken over the last 3 days, turning a deep, iridescent navy. His tiny, hooked claws kneaded rhythmically against Alexander's chest, sharp enough to snag the fabric of his shirt and prick the skin underneath. Alexander ignored the stinging. "Easy, buddy," Alexander murmured, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Don't choke." To his right, curled up in a tight ball on Alexander's thigh, was the runt, Squeak. Squeak was asleep, emitting a soft, whistling snore. The other two, Pip and Runt 2, were currently dragging themselves across the shredded velvet, playfully clicking and batting at each other with clumsy, uncoordinated limbs. Caring for them had been a nightmare of trial and error. The first night, they wouldn't stop crying. The sound had been deafening, a psychic weight that made Alexander's teeth ache. He realized they were freezing. The mother would have normally incubated them with her own massive body heat. Alexander had dragged every portable space heater he could find in the maintenance closets, forming a ring of blistering warmth around the velvet nest. He had stripped off his own jacket and laid it in the center. Only when he climbed into the nest with them, letting them crawl over his legs and stomach, had they finally calmed down. They were brutal, messy little things. They had no control over their bodily functions. Alexander had spent hours on his hands and knees, scrubbing caustic, highly acidic blue waste out of the expensive carpets with his industrial neutralizer. His hands were raw, the calluses worn down, the skin cracking around the knuckles. He pulled the empty coolant tube out of Tank's mouth. The little alien let out a disappointed chirp, smacking its mandibles together. "All gone," Alexander said, tossing the makeshift bottle onto the floor. He carefully lifted Tank, supporting the heavy, oversized head, and placed him gently into the velvet nest next to the space heaters. Tank immediately curled up, seeking the warmth, and fell asleep. Alexander leaned his head back against the sofa and closed his eyes. He needed to leave. He needed to clock out, go back to his cramped quarters in the lower rings, take a hot shower, and sleep for a week. If a supervisor found out what he was doing, he wouldn't just be fired. He'd be brought up on charges of biological tampering, but he couldn't open the door. Every time he thought about calling it in, he looked at Squeak's fragile little chest rising and falling, or felt the way Pip would press his cold, smooth forehead against Alexander's palm for comfort. They were monsters, literal apex predators that, in a few years, would grow into terrifying armored behemoths, capable of tearing a shuttle apart. But right now, they were just babies. And Alexander knew what it felt like to be abandoned in a cold, indifferent system. He cracked one eye open, looking at the ceiling. "If the mother doesn't come back by tomorrow," he whispered to the empty room, "I'm smuggling them down to the cargo bays. Thomas owes me a favor. We'll find a freighter." It was a stupid plan, a suicidal plan. A heavy, vibrating thud shook the floorboards beneath him. Alexander froze. The water in his mop bucket rippled. Thud. The vibration traveled up Alexander's spine. It was a heavy, rhythmic impact. Footsteps, massive footsteps coming down the corridor outside the suite. Thud, thud. The quadruplets woke up instantly. Squeak scrambled up Alexander's shirt, hiding behind his collar. Tank and the others let out sharp, high-pitched trills, their little antennae twitching frantically toward the door. Alexander scrambled to his feet, his knees screaming in protest. He grabbed his mop handle, a pathetic instinct to arm himself. The electronic lock on the door beeped. A sharp, angry red light flashed. The manual override. The heavy blast doors didn't just hiss open. They were violently shoved apart. The pneumatic seals shrieked as they were forced backward. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted as the hallway air rushed in. Alexander stopped breathing. Standing in the doorway was Queen Selene. She had to duck to get through the doorframe. The Queen was a towering monument to biological violence. Over 10 feet of jagged, obsidian-black chitin, layered in heavy, overlapping plates that looked like ancient armor. She stood on 4 massive digitigrade legs, each ending in a scythe-like talon that dug deep gouges into the station's expensive flooring with every step. Her upper torso was vaguely humanoid, but only in the sense that it possessed 2 primary arms and 2 secondary arms, all ending in terrifyingly sharp manipulators. She was not in her diplomatic robes. She was covered in deep, weeping gashes. One of her secondary arms was missing entirely, sheared off at the joint and leaking a thick, sluggish yellow fluid. The ozone smell radiating from her was overpowering, mixed with the stench of plasma burns and stale blood. She had been in a war zone. The emergency summit had clearly been an assassination attempt, or a coup. Her massive head swiveled. 6 glowing crimson eyes locked instantly onto the center of the room. She saw the shredded velvet. She saw the space heaters. And then, her eyes locked onto Alexander. Alexander stood frozen in the center of the room. He was holding a yellow plastic mop handle like a spear. In his left hand, dangling loosely by his side, was the empty coolant tube he'd used as a baby bottle. His uniform was covered in her children's vomit and waste. Hiding behind Alexander's ankles, peeking out nervously, was Tank. Squeak was still clinging desperately to the back of Alexander's shirt collar, trembling. The silence in the room was absolute, deafening in its intensity. Alexander could hear his own heartbeat hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was going to die. He knew it with total, crystalline certainty. This creature had just survived a massacre, traveled light years bleeding and broken, only to find a filthy human holding a stick over her young. The Queen let out a sound. It wasn't a roar. It was a low, guttural vibration that started in her chest and shook the dust from the ceiling tiles. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated territorial rage. She took a step forward, raising her primary right arm. The talon extended, a foot-long blade of black organic metal. Alexander didn't run. There was nowhere to go. Instead, a strange, exhausted calm washed over him. He was too tired to panic. He slowly lowered the mop handle, letting it clatter to the floor. He raised both his empty hands, the palms facing outward, showing the cracked, bleeding skin and the cheap yellow rubber gloves. "I didn't hurt them," Alexander said. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the silence. "They were cold. I kept them warm." The Queen paused, her talon inches from the ceiling. Her crimson eyes narrowed, focusing not on Alexander's face, but on his chest. She saw the stains. She saw the makeshift bottle. Then she looked down. Tank, braver than his siblings, let out a loud, demanding chirp. The little alien waddled out from behind Alexander's boot, completely ignoring the terrifying, bleeding behemoth above him. Tank marched directly to the dropped coolant tube, picked it up in his tiny claws, and held it up to Alexander, clicking his mandibles impatiently. The Queen froze. Her breathing, which had been heavy and ragged, hitched. She lowered her massive scythe-like arm. She took a slow, agonizing step forward, her joints popping loudly in the quiet room. She ignored Alexander completely. She collapsed heavily onto her front knees, the impact shaking the floor. She lowered her massive head until it was inches from the ground. Tank dropped the tube. He let out a joyful, high-pitched shriek and hurled himself at the Queen's face. The other 3 quadruplets abandoned their hiding spots. They swarmed out of the velvet nest and off Alexander's back, a wave of dark blue chitin rushing toward their mother. Alexander stepped back, his back hitting the wall. He slid down until he was sitting on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He watched, his chest heaving, as the Queen let out a completely different sound. It was a soft, vibrating hum. A purr. She used her remaining arms to gently scoop the 4 infants up, pressing them against her armored chest. The babies clicked and shrieked, burrowing into the gaps in her plating, seeking her warmth. The Queen closed her eyes, her massive head resting on the floor, letting her young wash over her. Alexander watched them for a long time. The terror slowly drained out of him, replaced by a hollow, aching exhaustion. His hands were shaking. He looked at the ruined suite, the spilled bucket, the blood on the floor. "Right," Alexander muttered to himself, rubbing his face. "Gonna need a lot more neutralizer for this." He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his knees cracking loudly. The sound made the Queen open her eyes. She turned her massive head toward him. The babies were safely tucked against her chest. She stared at Alexander. Alexander froze again, his hand resting on the wall for support. The Queen slowly reached out with one massive, terrifyingly sharp talon. Alexander flinched, bracing himself. The tip of the talon gently hooked the collar of Alexander's stained, terrible-smelling jacket. With surprising delicacy, she pulled him forward, just a few inches, until he was standing at the edge of the velvet nest. She didn't speak. Alexander didn't know if her species even could speak without a translator, but she looked at his raw, bleeding hands. She looked at the dark bags under his eyes, and she looked at the empty, makeshift baby bottle on the floor. The Queen lowered her head, pressing her hard, armored forehead gently against Alexander's chest, right over his heart. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but it carried the weight of a dying star. Then she pulled back, curling her body entirely around her young, turning her back to the door, and went to sleep. Alexander stood there for a moment in the dim purple light. He picked up his mop. He picked up his bucket. He quietly wheeled his cart out into the sterile, pine-scented hallway and gently pulled the blast door shut behind him. It was time to clock out. Alexander's quarters on deck 12 were exactly what you'd expect for a level 2 sanitation technician. It was a glorified storage closet carved out of the station's lower bulkhead, measuring a generous 8 by 10 feet. The walls hummed with the constant, vibrating groan of the primary water recyclers, and the air always tasted faintly of rust and recycled breath. He didn't care. When he had finally collapsed onto his thin, lumpy mattress, he hadn't even bothered to take off his boots. Sleep hit him like a physical blow. It was a dark, dreamless void, heavy and suffocating. He needed 10 hours. He needed a week. He got 45 minutes. The pounding on his door wasn't polite. It was rhythmic, heavy, and metallic. Bang, bang, bang. Alexander groaned, burying his face into his scratchy synthetic pillow. His entire body ached. His spine felt like it was made of crushed glass, and the raw skin on his knuckles throbbed in time with his erratic heartbeat. "Go away," he mumbled into the pillow. Bang, bang, bang. "Security, override authorized, stand back." The door didn't slide open. It was forced open, the manual lock snapping with a sharp crack. Harsh, blinding white light from the corridor flooded the dim room, searing Alexander's retinas. Two men in heavy tactical armor stepped inside, their helmets nearly scraping the low ceiling. They carried pulse rifles, though the weapons were pointed safely at the floor. The smell of polished plasteel and ozone rolled off them. Alexander slowly sat up, squinting through the glare, rubbing a hand over his deeply stubbled jaw. He looked at the cracked lock on his door, then at the heavily armed guards. "I'm off the clock," Alexander croaked. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "Get up, Alexander," the lead guard said. His voice was clipped, tight with adrenaline. "Chief Miller wants you in Sector 7, now." Alexander didn't argue. He didn't have the energy. He dragged himself out of bed, his joints popping, and grabbed his uniform jacket from the floor. It still smelled faintly of alien vomit and sour milk. He didn't care. They didn't cuff him, but they flanked him closely as they marched him to the transit elevator. The ride up to the command level was silent. Alexander leaned against the glass wall of the lift, watching the blurred lights of the station's commercial sectors streak by. His eyes kept sliding shut. Chief Miller's office was a glass-walled cube suspended over the main security hub. Miller was a stout, perpetually sweating man who looked like he was one bad shift away from a coronary. Right now, his face was flushed a dangerous shade of magenta. When Alexander was shoved through the door, Miller was pacing behind his desk, screaming into a comms headset. "I don't care what the protocol is. She ripped a Class 4 medical droid in half. If you send a strike team in there, she's going to slaughter them, and then her armada will turn this station into a debris field." Miller ripped the headset off, throwing it onto his desk. He glared at Alexander. Alexander stood in the center of the room, hands stuffed in his pockets, swaying slightly on his feet. "Alexander," Miller barked, leaning over his desk. "What the hell did you do in Suite 714? "I cleaned it," Alexander said flatly. "Don't play dumb with me." Miller tapped a heavy finger on his data terminal. A holographic projection flared to life in the center of the room. It was a security feed from the hallway outside the Envoy suite. The heavy blast doors were dented outward, buckling under immense internal pressure. Lying in the corridor was the sparking, oil-leaking chassis of a high-end medical droid. It looked like it had been put through an industrial shredder. "The Envoy returned," Miller said, his voice dropping to a furious hiss. "She triggered every bio-alarm on the deck. She's bleeding out, Alexander. She's missing an arm. Scanners show severe internal hemorrhaging. We sent a medical team to save her life." Miller pointed at the shredded droid. "She threw the doctors out and dismantled the droid with her bare claws. She's barricaded the door with the dining table, and she is broadcasting a single, repeating phrase on the diplomatic band." Miller tapped another button. A synthetic translation voice echoed through the office. Approach and be unmade. Send the keeper of the nest. Approach and be unmade. Send the keeper of the nest. Alexander stared at the hologram. He felt a dull, throbbing headache building right behind his eyes. "What is a keeper of the nest?" Miller demanded, stepping around the desk. "Xenoanthropology says it's a sacred caste, a royal guardian. She's refusing all contact until this priest, or whatever it is, arrives. The problem is, our logs show no one entered that room for 3 days except you." Alexander sighed. He looked down at his yellow rubber gloves, still tucked into his belt. He pulled one out, inspecting a tear in the thumb. "She doesn't want a priest, Miller," Alexander muttered, rubbing his temples. "She wants a babysitter." Miller stared at him, his jaw slightly slack. "What?" "Her kids," Alexander said, looking up, meeting the security chief's eyes. "She left 4 infants in there. They were starving and freezing. I spent the last 3 days feeding them nutrient paste out of a coolant tube and wiping acidic crap off the rugs." The silence in the office was absolute. Outside the glass walls, a dozen security analysts tapped frantically at their consoles, oblivious to the bombshell that had just been dropped inside. "You," Miller stammered, his face draining of color. "You made contact with the Sovereign's unweaned brood without authorization? Do you have any idea the biological contamination laws you broke? The diplomatic treaties?" "I kept them alive," Alexander snapped, a sudden, hot spike of anger piercing through his exhaustion. "Which is more than your automated systems did. Now you said she's bleeding out?" "Yes," Miller said, still looking shell-shocked. "She needs a coagulant infuser attached to her primary thorax, or she'll be dead in an hour." Alexander walked over to Miller's desk, leaned over, and picked up a heavy silver medical kit sitting near the terminal. He popped the latches, looking inside at the neat rows of syringes, autodocs, and surgical staplers. "Right," Alexander said, snapping the case shut and tucking it under his arm. "Then you better give me hazard pay, because I am not doing this on my standard hourly rate." Miller blinked. "You're going back in there?" "Someone has to," Alexander said, turning toward the door. "And frankly, she likes me better than you." Sector 7 looked like a war zone. The pristine white corridors were flashing with strobing amber emergency lights. 24 heavily armed security personnel had formed a perimeter 50 yards from Suite 714. They were huddled behind portable barricades, their rifles trained nervously on the dented blast doors. The air was thick with the smell of scorched metal, leaking hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, coppery tang of alien blood. Alexander pushed his janitorial cart through the barricade. The right wheel still had a flat spot. Squeak thud, squeak thud. The tactical officers stared at him in disbelief. Here was a man in a stained, wrinkled gray jumpsuit, carrying a medical kit under one arm, pushing a bucket of soapy water and a mop toward a monster that had just shredded a titanium chassis. "Hold your fire," Miller's voice crackled over the PA system. "Let him through." Alexander stopped 10 feet from the door. The damage was impressive. Deep, gouging claw marks had peeled the plasteel back like a tin can. The heavy oak dining table from the suite had been shoved into the gap, forming a crude but incredibly heavy blockade. Alexander took a deep breath. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but beneath the fear, there was a strange, grim resignation. He knew what he was walking into. He knew the smell. He knew the chaos. He set the medical kit down on top of his cart. He stepped up to the jagged gap in the door, put his hands on his hips, and cleared his throat. "Hey, Celine!" Alexander yelled, his voice echoing loudly in the tense corridor. The tactical officers behind him flinched, silence from inside the room. "It's Alexander," he continued, leaning slightly into the gap. "The guy with the mop. You're making a real mess out here. I've got medical supplies. I'm coming in. Don't stab me." He waited. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. A drop of sweat rolled down Alexander's neck, stinging a scratch on his collarbone. Then the heavy oak table shifted. There was a grating screech of wood on metal. A massive obsidian-black talon hooked over the edge of the table and effortlessly dragged the 300-pound piece of furniture backward, clearing the entryway. From the shadows of the unlit suite, 6 glowing crimson eyes peered out at him. The queen let out a low, vibrating hiss that rattled Alexander's teeth. It was a warning. Yeah, I know," Alexander muttered. He grabbed the handle of his cart. Squeak thud, squeak thud. He wheeled it straight through the mangled doors, completely ignoring the collective gasp from the strike team behind him. The suite was stiflingly hot, a humid jungle of shredded fabric and alien pheromones. The purple emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows against the walls. The queen was huddled in the center of the room, coiled defensively around the velvet nest. She looked terrible. The stump of her severed arm was leaking a steady stream of thick, yellow fluid onto the carpet, pooling darkly around her digitigrade legs. Her massive chest heaved with shallow, labored breaths. But her eyes were sharp, tracking Alexander's every movement. Alexander parked the cart. He picked up the medical kit. As he took a step forward, the queen rose slightly, baring her mandibles. She let out a sharp, clicking warning. Before Alexander could react, a small, pale blue blur launched itself from the velvet nest. Tank hit the floor running, his tiny hooked claws scrambling for traction on the polished wood. He ignored his mother's warning hiss, charging straight toward Alexander. The infant alien slammed into Alexander's shin, let out a joyful, high-pitched chirp, and immediately began climbing the leg of his jumpsuit like a squirrel ascending a tree. Alexander sighed, shifting his weight to balance the heavy medical kit. He reached down with his free hand and scooped Tank up by the scruff of his soft carapace. "Hey, buddy," Alexander said softly. "You're getting heavy." Tank clicked happily, nuzzling his wet, acidic snout against Alexander's jawline, completely indifferent to the tension in the room. The queen watched this exchange in absolute silence. Her aggressive posture slowly melted away. She lowered her massive body back to the floor, her breathing hitching painfully. She let out a soft, defeated chitter, resting her heavy armored head on the carpet. Alexander walked toward her, holding Tank in one arm and the medical kit in the other. He knelt down beside her massive, terrifying head. The smell of copper and ozone was overpowering up close. "All right, Celine," Alexander murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. "I have no idea what I'm doing, so you're going to have to bear with me." He popped the medical kit open. He pulled out the coagulant infuser, a heavy, brutal-looking syringe meant for trauma wounds. The queen's eyes followed his hands. She knew what the device was. Slowly, agonizingly, she shifted her body, exposing the ragged, leaking stump of her secondary arm. Alexander swallowed hard. The biology was completely alien to him. There were exposed tubes, pulsing sacs of fluid, and jagged ridges of black chitin. "Okay," Alexander whispered. "On 3, 1, 2. He jammed the infuser into the thickest mass of pulsing tissue and pulled the trigger. The queen let out a deafening, echoing shriek of pain. Her massive body convulsed, throwing Alexander backward. He hit the floor hard, sliding across the slick, fluid-stained carpet, clutching Tank to his chest to protect the infant from the impact. Outside, he could hear the strike team shouting, weapons charging. "Hold your fire!" Alexander screamed at the top of his lungs, scrambling to his knees. "I'm fine. Do not come in here." He looked back at the queen. She was panting heavily, her crimson eyes squeezed shut. But the yellow fluid leaking from her shoulder had rapidly begun to foam and harden, creating a thick, synthetic scab over the catastrophic wound. The bleeding had stopped. Slowly, the queen opened her eyes. She looked at her shoulder. Then she looked at Alexander. She didn't hiss. She didn't raise her talons. Instead, she let out that same low, rumbling purr from the night before. It vibrated through the floorboards, settling deep in Alexander's chest. From the velvet nest, Squeak, Pip, and Runt 2 poked their heads out, chirping in response to their mother's purr. They scrambled over the shredded curtains, waddling toward Alexander. Within seconds, he was covered in them. Squeak burrowed into his jacket pocket, while Pip and Runt 2 fought for space on his lap. Alexander sat in the middle of the ruined, bloody suite, covered in alien apex predators, staring at a 10-foot-tall matriarch who could snap him like a twig. The queen reached out with her primary arm. Alexander stiffened, but she simply tapped the side of his mop bucket with one massive, razor-sharp talon. Clink. She looked at the spilled fluids on the carpet. Then she looked at Alexander, tilting her head slightly. Alexander stared at her. Then he looked at the bucket. Then he looked back at the queen. A breathless, incredulous laugh escaped his lips. "You've got to be kidding me. You want me to clean?" The queen purred again, settling her massive head onto her front legs, closing her eyes in exhaustion. Alexander shook his head, a cynical smile cracking his dry lips. He gently scooped the infants off his lap and placed them next to their mother. He pushed himself up, his back screaming in protest, and walked over to his cart. He tapped his comms earpiece. "Miller, you read me?" "I read you, Alexander," Miller's voice came back, shaky and thin. "Status? She's stable. The bleeding stopped," Alexander said, plunging his mop into the soapy water and wringing it out. "But I need you to update my personnel file." "Update it to what?" Alexander threw the wet mop onto the floor, dragging it across a puddle of yellow blood. "Sanitation technician, first class. And tell payroll I want a 20% bump. The keeper of the nest doesn't work for minimum wage." Alexander hated the smell of the administration level. It wasn't the aggressive pine of the lower decks or the suffocating metallic ozone of security. It was a subtle, insidious blend of peppermint air freshener and expensive synthetic leather. It smelled like people who didn't sweat for a living. He sat rigidly in a high-backed chair that was ergonomically designed for someone 3 inches taller than him. Across the polished mahogany table sat Station Administrator Collins. Collins was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and tailored gray suits. He was currently staring at Alexander with a mixture of profound fascination and deep, instinctual disgust. Alexander didn't blame him. He hadn't showered in 2 days. The knees of his uniform were crusted with a flaky, translucent substance that looked like dried glue, but was actually molted alien carapace. He smelled like a fish market left out in the sun. "Let me ensure I fully grasp the situation, Mr. Carter," Collins said, steepling his perfectly manicured fingers. "The sovereign envoy of a species that controls a third of the Orion Spur is refusing all diplomatic contact. She has blockaded herself inside our luxury suite, dismantled 300,000 credits worth of medical and security equipment, and will only allow a Tier 2 sanitation worker into her presence." "Tier 1, Alexander corrected, his voice raspy. "Miller pushed the promotion through yesterday. I get a new badge on Tuesday." Collins closed his eyes for a brief, pained moment. "Right, Tier 1, and your primary duty in this diplomatic capacity is what, exactly?" "I bring them frozen synthetic beef from the commissary," Alexander said, ticking items off on his raw, calloused fingers. "I run the space heaters. I wipe down the walls when the kids spit up, because their saliva eats through the drywall, and I clean out the nesting area. You clean." Collins leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Alexander, do you understand the political leverage sitting in that room? The chitinous collectives have never allowed a human near their unweaned young. It's a sacred caste. You have unprecedented access. We need you to initiate a dialogue. We need to know who attacked her at the summit, and we need to secure the mining rights in the Cygnus sector before she leaves." Alexander let out a dry, hacking laugh. It sounded like a rusty hinge. "Dialogue?" Alexander rubbed his bloodshot eyes. "She doesn't talk, Collins. She purrs, she hisses, and she clicks. I don't speak bug. The only dialogue we have is when she taps my mop bucket to tell me I missed a spot under the sofa. If you want mining rights, you go in there and ask her. But take a shield. She's cranky. Her shoulder is infected." Collins frowned, his peppermint scent suddenly seeming sour. "You are an employee of this station. You will act as our liaison, or you will be terminated." Alexander stood up. His lower back popped loudly in the quiet boardroom. He leaned over the mahogany table, planting his knuckles on the polished wood. "Fire me," Alexander said softly. "Please, I am begging you. Take my key card. Go down to Deck 7 and tell a 10-foot-tall, heavily armored apex predator who just had her arm chopped off that you fired her nanny." Collins stared at him. The sharp angles of his face seemed to melt slightly, replaced by genuine apprehension. Alexander grabbed his stained cap from the table and shoved it onto his head. "I didn't think so. Now, if we're done here, Squeak is teething on the plasteel table legs, and if I don't give him a frozen wrench to chew on, he's going to bring the ceiling down." He walked out, leaving the administrator in silence. By the time Alexander made it back to Suite 714, the headache was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat behind his eyes. He keyed the manual override. The ruined blast doors had been replaced by a temporary, heavy-duty force field. The guards on duty, two nervous-looking kids fresh out of the academy, deactivated it without a word, stepping well back as Alexander pushed his cart through. The heat inside hit him like a physical wall. The suite was a sweltering, humid jungle. Things were changing rapidly. The quadruplets had hit a growth spurt. They were no longer the size of house cats. They were the size of aggressive golden retrievers. Their pale, soft carapaces had hardened into overlapping plates of midnight blue armor. The room looked like a war zone of shed skin. Transparent, hollow husks of their former shapes were littered across the shredded velvet and ruined furniture. It crunched under Alexander's boots like broken glass. "I'm back," Alexander called out, tossing a heavy sack of frozen synthetic beef onto the floor. The pile of velvet shifted. Celine raised her massive head. The yellow, foamy scab on her shoulder had darkened to a sickly brown. She looked exhausted, her 6 crimson eyes dull and unfocused. She let out a weak, rattling breath that barely qualified as a purr. Alexander's chest tightened. He didn't like how she looked. The station medics refused to come near her, and his rudimentary first aid was reaching its limits. Before he could check on her, a blue blur slammed into his thighs. Tank had figured out how to jump. The infant alien hit Alexander waist high, its heavy, armored head knocking the wind out of him. Alexander stumbled backward, crashing into his cleaning cart. Bottles of industrial solvent clattered to the floor. Tank stood on his hind legs, pinning Alexander against the cart, and let out a demanding guttural shriek, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "Off," Alexander grunted, pushing against the alien's heavy chest. "Down. You weigh 80 pounds, you menace." Tank dropped to the floor, instantly distracted by the sack of frozen beef. He tore into the thick canvas with his hooked claws, the sound of rending fabric filling the room. Squeak, Pip, and Runt 2 scrambled out from beneath their mother, a chaotic swarm of clicking limbs and clicking jaws, joining their brother in tearing the frozen meat to shreds. Alexander watched them, panting slightly. He grabbed a bottle of heavy-duty degreaser from the floor and a fresh rag. He walked over to Celine. The massive queen didn't flinch as he approached. She just watched him with heavy, tired eyes. Alexander knelt down beside her injured shoulder. The smell was atrocious, sickly sweet and rotten. Infection. "You're not doing so hot, B," Alexander muttered. He uncapped the degreaser. It was meant for stripping Starship engine grease, highly toxic, but it was the strongest antibacterial agent he had access to. He poured a small amount onto the rag. The fumes made his eyes water instantly. "This is going to sting," he warned her. He pressed the chemical-soaked rag against the edge of her wound. Celine let out a sharp, deafening hiss. Her massive body convulsed, a reflex of pure agony. One of her massive scythe-like legs kicked out, catching Alexander squarely in the chest. He was thrown backward, flying through the air, and slammed hard against the far wall. The air left his lungs in a violent rush. He crumpled to the floor, coughing violently, tasting copper in the back of his throat. The babies stopped eating. They froze, turning their heads toward Alexander, then toward their mother. Celine scrambled to her feet, ignoring her wound. She let out a panicked, vibrating trill. She crossed the room in 2 massive strides, looming over Alexander. She lowered her head, sniffing him frantically, her mandibles trembling. Alexander waved a hand weakly, gasping for air. I'm fine, just bruised ribs. Good kick." The queen purred, a frantic, worried sound. She used her massive, terrifying talon to gently prod Alexander's shoulder, trying to roll him onto his back. It was a gesture of such bizarre, maternal clumsiness that Alexander couldn't help but laugh, even as it sent sharp spikes of pain through his chest. "I said I'm fine, you overgrown cockroach," he wheezed, grabbing her talon to steady himself. The dark metal was warm to the touch. They stayed like that for a moment, the human janitor sitting on the floor, clutching his ribs, holding the hand of an alien warlord. Alexander closed his eyes, resting his head against the wall. He was so tired, he just wanted to sleep. but sleep wasn't on the schedule. It was 0300 hours station time. The environmental lights in Suite 714 had cycled down to a deep bruised purple. Alexander was sitting in the corner of the room, perched on an overturned plastic bucket. He was holding a data pad, squinting at the cracked screen, trying to figure out how to order medical-grade antibiotics through the black market using his sanitation credentials. The suite was quiet, save for the heavy rhythmic breathing of the Queen and the soft clicking of the quadruplets shifting in their sleep. The heat was oppressive, sticking Alexander's shirt to his back. He rubbed his eyes, letting out a long, slow exhale. Then, the ambient temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Alexander froze. He didn't look up immediately. He just stopped breathing. He knew this station's climate systems inside and out. The HVAC didn't just drop like that unless a localized atmospheric seal had been breached. The heavy force field blocking the doorway flickered. The soft blue hum turned into a harsh, static buzz, and then the field simply vanished. No alarm sounded. No security guards yelled. Alexander slowly lowered his data pad. He slipped his hand into his tool belt, wrapping his fingers around the heavy, solid metal handle of his universal wrench. A figure stepped through the ruined doorway. It wasn't a station guard. The intruder was clad in a sleek, light-bending camouflage suit that made them look like a ripple in the air. The faint purple light of the suite barely caught the edges of their silhouette. They moved with absolute, terrifying silence, their boots making no sound against the shredded carpet. The smell of ozone and sterile weapon oil flooded the room. Alexander's heart slammed against his bruised ribs. The summit. The people who tried to kill Celine hadn't stopped looking for her. They had just found a quieter way in. The assassin didn't even notice Alexander sitting in the dark corner. Their attention was entirely fixed on the massive, sleeping bulk of the Queen in the center of the room. The intruder raised a long, cylindrical weapon. A faint, high-pitched whine began to build in the air, the charging of a plasma lance, a weapon designed to punch through heavy starship armor, or a Queen's carapace. Alexander didn't think. He didn't weigh his options. He didn't consider that he was a guy making 16 credits an hour, facing down a professional wetwork operative. He just reacted. He stood up, grabbed his industrial mop bucket by the handle, and hurled the entire thing at the assassin. It wasn't a heroic, perfectly aimed throw. The heavy plastic bucket slipped in Alexander's sweaty hands. It flipped end over end, wildly off balance, but it held 3 gallons of heavily diluted, highly corrosive floor stripper. The bucket clipped the assassin's shoulder. The plastic shattered. 3 gallons of foaming toxic chemical liquid exploded outward, drenching the intruder. The cloaking suit sparked violently. The light-bending technology short-circuited as the corrosive liquid ate into the delicate microweave. The camouflage dropped, revealing a tall, slender humanoid in dark tactical armor. The assassin let out a muffled shout of surprise, staggering sideways. The plasma lance fired wildly. A searing beam of blinding white heat shot across the room, incinerating a patch of the wall 3 feet above Alexander's head. The heat blistered Alexander's skin instantly. Alexander panicked. He dropped his wrench. He scrambled backward, slipping on the wet floor, and fell hard onto his hands and knees. "B!" Alexander screamed, his voice cracking in terror. "Wake up!" The assassin recovered with terrifying speed. They dropped the overheated plasma lance and drew a serrated, glowing vibro blade from their hip. They locked eyes on Alexander, a silent, deadly promise, and lunged. Alexander scrambled backward like a crab, kicking wildly. He was dead. He knew it. The blade was a blur of motion. A massive shadow blotted out the purple lights. Celine hadn't just woken up. She had exploded from sleep. The queen moved with a speed that defied her immense size. She didn't roar. She didn't hiss. She was entirely, terrifyingly silent. Before the assassin could bring the blade down on Alexander, a scythe-like talon the size of a man's leg swung through the air. The impact sounded like a car crash. The talon struck the assassin in the chest. The heavy tactical armor shattered like cheap plastic. The assassin was thrown backward with enough force to dent the plasteel wall of the suite, crumpling to the floor in a broken, lifeless heap. Silence slammed back into the room, deafening and heavy. Alexander lay on his back on the wet carpet, his chest heaving. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He stared at the crumpled body of the assassin, then up at the ceiling. A hysterical, breathless sob tore its way out of his throat. Celine stood over him. She was breathing heavily, her massive chest rising and falling. Her injured shoulder was leaking fresh fluid, the scab torn open by the violent movement. She looked down at Alexander. She reached out with her uninjured primary arm and very gently hooked her talon under the collar of his jumpsuit, pulling him upright into a sitting position. From the velvet nest, the babies woke up. Tank waddled over, sleepily rubbing his mandibles, and sniffed the dead assassin. He let out a disgusted click and trotted over to Alexander, burying his heavy head into Alexander's lap. Alexander sat there, petting the armored head of an apex predator, staring at the corpse in his living room. He smelled burnt plasma, floor stripper, and alien blood. He slowly reached up and tapped his comms earpiece. His fingers left smears of grease on his cheek. "Miller," Alexander croaked. His voice shook badly. "Alexander, the blast doors just registered a bypass. Are you okay?" Alexander looked at Celine. The queen was watching the doorway, her crimson eyes burning in the dim light. "I need a biohazard crew," Alexander whispered, running a trembling hand over his face. "And a body bag. And Miller?" "Yeah, Alexander. Tell Collins to get his diplomatic team ready, because when her armor finishes molting, she's not hiding in here anymore." The station was in a total lockdown. Security teams were crawling through the ventilation ducts, and for the first time in the history of the Spire, the elite diplomatic delegates were being told to stay in their rooms. Alexander sat in the center of Suite 714, surrounded by an absolute suffocating silence. The body of the assassin had been removed by Miller's men, but the dark, sticky stain on the carpet remained. Alexander wasn't allowed to clean it yet. "Evidence," Miller had said, his face gray with terror. Alexander didn't care about evidence. He cared about the fact that Celine was dying. The adrenaline of the fight had faded, and now the toll was obvious. The infection had spread. Her massive shoulder was swollen, the black chitin cracked and oozing thick, necrotic fluids. She was lying on her side, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Tank, Pip, Squeak, and Runt 2 were uncharacteristically quiet. They weren't fighting or playing. They were huddled in a tight, protective circle around their mother's head, their tiny mandibles clicking in a low, rhythmic, sorrowful tune. Alexander sat at the edge of the velvet nest. He was exhausted, his bones feeling as though they were being ground into dust. He looked at the medical kit, now empty of everything useful. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the queen. He didn't know if she understood him. He didn't know if her species felt mercy or gratitude. But she opened one crimson eye, the multifaceted surface dull and cloudy. She shifted slightly, her heavy tail brushing against Alexander's knee, a gesture that felt less like a threat and more like an anchor. The door chime buzzed, a polite, tentative sound that didn't belong in this room. Alexander stood up, his knees popping like dry wood. He walked to the force field and deactivated it. Standing in the hallway was Miller, looking older than Alexander had ever seen him, and behind him, a woman in a crisp white lab coat, carrying a heavy, pressurized case. "This is Dr. Aris," Miller said, his voice quiet. "Head of xenobiology. She says she's heard rumors." "Rumors?" Alexander stepped back, letting them in. "That there's a sovereign royal in here who is currently undergoing a localized rapid mutation," Aris said, her eyes wide as she stepped into the suite. She stopped dead when she saw Celine. Her mouth fell open. "By the stars, the shedding, she's not just molting, she's transitioning." "What does that mean?" Alexander asked, his voice sharp. "It means her body is trying to purge the infection through a radical biological overwrite," Aris explained, kneeling down near the queen's shoulder. She opened her case, revealing a glowing array of stabilizers. "But she's too weak to finish it. She's going to collapse her own vital systems to shed the damaged armor." Aris looked at Alexander. "She needs an external catalyst. High-density protein, synthetic enzymes, and a blood-compatible stimulant. If we don't give it to her, she dies in the hour." Alexander looked at his cart. He looked at the pile of discarded translucent husks from the children. "I have the nutrient paste," Alexander said, "but it's not enough." "It has to be human integrated," Aris said, her voice dropping. "It's a known but classified biological quirk. Their royal line, it requires a symbiotic spark during extreme trauma. It's why they never left their home world. They couldn't survive the deep space mutations without an anchor." Alexander stared at her. The room felt suddenly very cold. "What are you asking?" "I need your blood, Alexander," Aris said, holding up a long, sterile needle. "Just a few units, mixed with the enzymes. It acts as a bridge." Alexander didn't hesitate. He pulled up his sleeve, exposing a vein he'd punctured 1,000 times with exhaustion and hard labor. He didn't look at the needle. He looked at Selena's crimson eyes, watching him from the shadows of the velvet. "Do it," he said. As the machine hummed, pulling the life out of him, Alexander felt his vision swim. He felt the weight of his own mundane life. The squeaky cart, the smell of pine, the aching back dissolve into something else. He was the anchor. He was the reason the queen would live. And as the golden fluid flowed into the queen's wound, he saw her blink, a sudden spark of life returning to those dying eyes. She looked at him, and for the first time, Alexander didn't see a monster. He saw a mother. The departure of the queen was not a diplomatic affair. There were no banners, no ambassadors, no speeches. It was an early Tuesday morning, the air still thick with the smell of cleaning solvents. The heavy blast doors of Suite 714 were fully retracted, revealing the hallway packed with silent security personnel. Celine stood. She was no longer the broken, bleeding thing that had crawled into this room. The new armor covering her shoulder was a brilliant, iridescent silver, etched with natural patterns that looked like constellations. She stood 10 feet tall, a statue of living steel, radiating a power that made the very air hum. Behind her, the quadruplets walked with a newfound predatory grace. They were fully armored now, sleek and silent, their eyes tracking the humans with a terrifying, intelligent curiosity. The queen stopped in front of Alexander. The janitor stood in his stained gray jumpsuit, holding his mop. He felt incredibly small. He felt like the air around her was pressing against his skin. She lowered her head. She brought her face inches from his. He could see the intricate architecture of her mandibles, the deep glowing heat of her eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She reached out with her primary arm and touched the chest of his jumpsuit, right over his heart, the same place she had touched when she first came home. Then she reached down and gently removed the cheap plastic name tag from his shirt. Alexander, Sanitation. She held the tag between two razor-sharp talons, looking at it with what looked like profound alien solemnity. Then she tucked it into the intricate silver grooves of her own chest armor. It was a sign, a vow. She turned and walked toward the hangar bay, her gait silent and regal. The quadruplets followed in a perfect formation, their claws clicking in a rhythmic martial cadence. Alexander watched them go. He watched the great obsidian and silver doors of the shuttle bay hiss shut, cutting off the view of the starship rising into the dark, indifferent expanse of space. He stood there for a long time. "Well," Miller said from behind him, his voice sounding hollow, "they're gone. The mining rights. They signed the treaty before they left. The station is going to be rich, Alexander." Alexander didn't answer. He turned around, picked up his mop, and pushed his cart toward the elevator. Squeak thud, squeak thud. He looked down at the floor. There was a faint, shimmering residue where the queen had stood, a dusting of silver scales, bright as starlight. He didn't clean it up. He just kept pushing his cart, heading back to his 8x10 closet on deck 12. He was still a janitor. He was still tired. His back still hurt. But as he looked out the viewport at the swirling nebula in the distance, he knew one thing for certain. Somewhere out there, in the cold, dark silence of the galaxy, the queen was watching. And he wasn't just a man with a mop anymore. He was a friend of the throne. Alexander's life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after saving an entire species. But the station has changed, and so has he. He's no longer just the guy in the hallway. He's a legend whispered among the lower decks. If you loved this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep space drama. Leave a comment. What do you think the queen will do when she returns? Share this with a friend